Welcome to this special podcast, sponsored by Murphy Business Sales Edison, New Jersey office, where your business aspirations meet expert guidance. Whether you're looking to sell your business or explore new acquisition opportunities, we are here to support you every step of the way. Join us as our hosts deep dive into small business topics which are relevant for buyers, sellers, and other transaction advisors in the ecosystem.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving straight into a topic with the potential to touch just about every corner of the U.S. economy. Tariffs. Simply put, tariffs are taxes on goods brought into the country. Think of it as a kind of import tax. There are a few common forms. Ad valorem tariffs, which are a percentage of the import's value.
Right, like a sales tax.
Exactly. Then there are specific tariffs, a set fee per item, like, say, $10 per imported bicycle, and compound tariffs, which kind of blend both of these.
And what's fascinating, I think, is why tariffs have been used throughout history and, well, what motivates their use today. Initially, for many nations, including the early U.S., tariffs were actually a primary source of government revenue.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but the modern application leans more towards protecting domestic industries. This protection, it can be intended for emerging industries needing a boost, or sectors vital for national security, or even to counter what are seen as unfair trade practices, such as dumping, selling goods below cost, or the use of government subsidies that give foreign producers an unfair advantage.
Right. Leveling the playing field, supposedly.
Supposedly. Tariffs are also sometimes employed to try and correct trade imbalances, where a country consistently imports significantly more than it exports, and even as a tool in international relations to exert geopolitical influence. So, as you can see, the reasons behind tariffs are multifaceted, often a blend of economic and, well, strategic political goals.
Okay, let's unpack this in light of some pretty significant news. Just this week, on April 2nd and 3rd of 2025, President Trump announced a really broad set of new tariffs. It's not just a few specific items, it's quite comprehensive.
It really is.
As of April 5th, we're looking at a baseline 10% tariff on imports from all countries. But here's where it gets really interesting for understanding the potential impact. Certain nations with substantial trade surpluses with the U.S. are facing even higher rates starting April 9th. That means a 34% tariff on goods from China, 20% from the European Union, and 24% from Japan.
Wow, those are big numbers.
And there's more come May 2nd, the duty-free de minimis treatment, which often allows small shipments to avoid tariffs. Well, that's ending for goods coming from China. Finally, just yesterday, April 3rd, a 25% tariff was implemented on imported automobiles.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, as someone closely watching economic policy, you can see this isn't a minor adjustment. This is a substantial shift in U.S. trade policy with the potential for wide-ranging consequences right here at home.
Definitely.
And that's precisely what we aim to explore this deep dive. Our mission is to extract the most critical insights from expert analyses and reports to help you, the listener, understand the potential economic repercussions of these tariffs for the U.S. economy without getting lost in overly technical details or, feeling overwhelmed by information.
Exactly. So let's start by looking at the overall health of the U.S. economy. What are the anticipated macroeconomic effects of these tariffs? The big picture stuff.
Well, the prevailing view among economists is that increased tariffs tend to have adverse aggregate effects on a nation's economic output, its gross domestic product, or GDP.
Okay, adverse effects.
Right. Numerous studies examining data across various countries over extended periods have found a statistically significant link between higher tariffs and a slowdown in output growth. One piece of research suggests that a relatively modest increase in tariffs, around 3.6 percentage points, could lead to a 0.4% reduction in economic output within 5 years.
Within 5 years, that's quite specific.
It is, and it's important for you to understand that this isn't typically a temporary dip. The negative impact tends to persist over time.
So it's not a case of some short-term discomfort for a significant long-term economic gain, then?
That's generally not what the data suggests, no. Findings from major institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, that's a nonpartisan think tank studying international economic issues. They largely support this view. They point to medium-term declines in both a country's domestic output and its productivity as a consequence of raising tariffs.
Productivity, too. How does that work?
Well, if we think about the reasons behind this, tariffs essentially lessen the competitive pressures on domestic firms. With less international competition, there might be less incentive for those firms to adopt superior technologies or, more efficient production methods. The IMF specifically backs this idea, finding a connection between increases in tariffs and declines in productivity growth.
That makes sense intuitively. If you don't face stiff competition, the urgency to innovate and improve might just not be there as much. Now, what about a key argument often made in favor of tariffs, that they will help reduce the U.S. trade deficit? What does the evidence say about that?
Ah, yes. That's a crucial question for anyone looking at the intended outcomes of these policies, and the research doesn't offer much support for tariffs being an effective tool in reducing trade deficits.
Really?
Yeah, the IMF, for instance, has found that increases in tariffs have only a very minor and statistically insignificant impact on a country's trade balance.
Minor and insignificant.
Exactly. The PIIE goes even further, suggesting that tariffs are actually unlikely to shrink trade deficits and could even exacerbate them.
Worsen them? How?
Their reasoning is that tariffs can sometimes lead to an appreciation in a country's currency. Think of it this way. If the dollar becomes stronger due to tariffs, our goods become more expensive for other countries to buy, hurting exports, while their goods become cheaper for us to buy, increasing imports.
Oh, right. Counterintuitive.
It can be, potentially negating the intended effect of the tariff on the trade balance. Interestingly, data even shows a correlation where countries with higher tariff rates tend to have larger trade deficits, indicating that other underlying economic factors are likely more important, not just the tariffs themselves.
So, for you following the big economic trends, the main takeaway on the macro level seems to be that tariffs generally act as a drag on the economy. They hinder growth, they hurt productivity, and they don't really solve the trade deficit problem.
That summarizes the consensus pretty well, yeah.
Let's turn our attention now to how these tariffs might affect the job market here in the U.S. Who might see job gains, and where could we see losses?
That's a really important consideration for American workers, absolutely. There's often a debate about whether tariffs lead to job creation in the industries that are protected from foreign competition, while potentially causing job losses in other sectors.
The classic trade-off argument.
Right. And the evidence suggests that while some jobs might indeed be created in those shielded industries, tariffs can definitely lead to job losses in other areas of the economy. This can occur in industries that heavily rely on imported parts and materials as their costs increase.
Okay, higher input costs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can also happen in export-oriented industries if other countries retaliate with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Retaliation. We'll come back to that. But we saw some evidence of this job effect from more recent tariffs, didn't we?
Exactly. When the U.S. imposed tariffs between 2018 and 2019, research indicates that industries that used a significant amount of imported inputs actually experienced a net loss of jobs due to those higher production costs.
Net loss, so more loss than gained.
Correct. And studies specifically analyzing those 2018 tariffs found that manufacturing industries that faced tariff increases saw a relative reduction in employment. Any potential job gains from import protection were overshadowed by the negative effects of those higher input costs and the retaliatory tariffs that other countries implemented. The Brookings Institution even estimated that if the U.S., Canada, and Mexico were to impose 25% tariffs on each other, we could see significant job losses in all three countries.
That paints a concerning picture for overall employment.
It does. And we have historical precedents as well. Back in 2002, when the U.S. placed tariffs on steel imports.
I remember that.
Yeah, well, more jobs were lost in industries that use steel than were saved in the domestic steel production sector itself. Tariffs can also have a broader impact on wages. The Brookings Institution suggests they can actually lead to lower wages overall due to the increased costs and reduced overall economic activity.
Lower wages, too.
Potentially, yes. While tariffs might cause a shift of jobs from one industry to another, that doesn't necessarily mean we have a more efficient use of labor. And some research points to a potential decrease in overall labor productivity. So while the idea of protecting domestic jobs with tariffs might sound appealing on the surface, the reality is often more complex and can result in a net negative impact on employment because of those higher costs and, importantly, the risk of retaliation.
Okay, so the impact on jobs is likely more negative than positive overall. Now let's talk about how these tariffs might directly affect the money in our pockets. What's the anticipated impact on inflation and the prices we pay for goods and services?
Right. This is where the impact of tariffs often becomes very tangible for everyday consumers. Tariffs directly increase the cost of imported goods, and we've already seen an upward trend in the average effective tariff rate. Now, the critical question for you as a consumer is, How much of that increased cost is passed on to us in the form of higher prices?
Yeah, who pays?
Well, empirical research suggests a fairly high pass-through rate, often close to 100%.
Wow, 100%.
Close to it, often. This means that almost the entire cost of the tariff tends to be borne by domestic consumers and businesses through higher prices.
So this could really take a bite out of household budgets.
Precisely. Think back to the tariffs imposed on washing machines in 2018. Studies showed that not only did the prices of imported washing machines increase, but so did the prices of domestically produced ones.
Even the domestic ones.
Yes, and even dryers, which weren't subject to the new tariffs at all.
Huh. Ripple effects.
Exactly. Looking ahead to these newly announced 2025 tariffs, the Yale Budget Lab has projected substantial increases at the overall price level, leading to significant average consumer losses per household. Many economists are increasingly concerned that these new tariffs could significantly fuel inflation while simultaneously slowing down economic growth.
Uh-oh.
Some are even raising concerns about the potential for stagflation that's a combination of slow economic growth and high inflation, or even a recession. Both Brookings and the PIE have predicted higher inflation as a likely consequence of these tariffs.
So a double whammy of higher prices and slower growth.
That's the concern. Ultimately, tariffs function like a tax on consumption. They contribute to inflationary pressures and erode our purchasing power, and this also disproportionately affects lower-income families because they typically spend a larger portion of their income on essential goods.
Right, hits the basics harder. So it sounds like we could be looking at higher prices for a wide range of goods, putting a strain on household finances. Now, let's delve into how specific sectors of the U.S. economy might be affected by these tariffs. Let's start with the manufacturing sector.
Okay, manufacturing. This sector is particularly vulnerable due to its extensive reliance on intricate global supply chains.
Very interconnected.
Extremely. Tariffs can create significant disruptions in these networks, substantially increasing costs for U.S. manufacturers who depend on imported components and raw materials. Faced with these higher costs, many businesses might opt to restructure their supply chains, perhaps relocating production to countries not subject to these high tariffs, rather than bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., which is sometimes the stated goal.
So not necessarily reshoring then, maybe just shifting elsewhere.
Potentially, yes. And the uncertainty surrounding these tariff policies also makes it incredibly challenging for manufacturers to engage in long-term planning, affecting investment and sourcing decisions. Consider the automotive industry. It's a prime example of highly integrated international production.
Yeah, parts come from everywhere.
Exactly. Tariffs on parts coming from key trading partners, for instance, can have significant cascading effects. More broadly, tariffs on intermediate goods, those used in the production of other goods, directly raise production costs for domestic manufacturers. Research has indicated a correlation between higher tariffs and increased producer prices due to these rising input costs.
Squeezing margins.
Definitely. For manufacturers already operating with tight profit margins, these added costs can threaten their ability to invest and maintain their workforce. Tariffs can also negatively impact the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturers, both domestically and in international markets. Higher input costs can negate any intended benefits from import protection, potentially leading to job losses within the sector.
So hurting the very sector it might aim to help.
It can happen. And by shielding domestic firms from competition, tariffs might actually hinder innovation, removing the pressure to address underlying inefficiencies that made them less competitive in the first place. Historically, some evidence suggests that tariffs implemented in the late 19th century did not significantly boost the productivity of U.S. businesses and might have even had a detrimental effect.
Less incentive to improve.
And when tariffs result in higher input costs, domestic manufacturers may be compelled to raise their own prices, making their goods less attractive in export markets. So while tariffs might be intended to provide a boost to manufacturing, their impact can be quite damaging due to the complexities of global supply chains and increased costs.
It sounds like the intended benefits for manufacturing could easily be outweighed by unintended negative consequences. What about the agricultural sector, which also has significant ties to international trade?
Agriculture. Another area that's highly susceptible to the effects of tariff policies, particularly through retaliatory tariffs imposed by other countries.
Retaliation again. Seems key.
It's huge in agriculture. When one country implements tariffs, its trading partners often respond by placing tariffs on agricultural goods, leading to substantial disruptions in export markets. The U.S. Department of Agriculture actually estimated that retaliatory tariffs reduced U.S. agricultural exports by approximately $27 billion between mid-2018 and the end of 2019.
Wow, $27 billion?
Yeah, with soybeans being particularly hard hit. Simulations by the Brookings Institution also project significant declines in U.S. agricultural exports to key trading partners like Canada and Mexico as a result of tariffs.
So losing customers abroad.
Precisely. Imposing tariffs on agricultural imports from countries like Canada and Mexico could substantially reduce trade in a wide array of farm products. And just as with other goods, tariffs on imported agricultural products can lead to higher food prices for domestic consumers.
Higher grocery bills.
Potentially. Domestic agricultural producers might also raise their prices in response to reduced competition from imports. It's important to note that agricultural tariffs tend to be regressive, meaning they disproportionately affect lower-income households who spend a larger percentage of their income on food.
There's that regressive impact again.
Yes. Farmers themselves might also face increased costs for essential inputs, such as machinery and fertilizers, if those are subject to tariffs.
Higher costs for farmers, too.
Could be. On a global scale, agricultural tariffs can lead to an inefficient allocation of resources and greater instability in international agricultural markets. Conversely, studies suggest that the removal of agricultural tariffs worldwide could actually increase the value of trade and boost agricultural incomes.
Interesting contrast.
The agricultural sector often bears a significant portion of the negative consequences of tariff policies, especially through those retaliatory measures that disrupt crucial export markets and create greater price volatility, ultimately harming both farmers and consumers. The U.S. agricultural sector's strong reliance on exports makes it particularly vulnerable.
So it seems farmers could face a double whammy of reduced export opportunities and potentially higher input costs. Finally, what about the impact on everyday consumer goods, the items we regularly purchase in stores?
Right, this is where consumers often feel the impact most directly through higher retail prices on imported consumer goods. These tariffs translate directly into increased costs at the checkout, reducing the purchasing power of households.
Less money to spend elsewhere.
Exactly. As we discussed earlier, the Yale Budget Lab estimates significant average per household consumer losses resulting from both recently implemented and proposed tariffs. Consumers can anticipate seeing price increases on a wide variety of everyday items, ranging from clothing and electronics to vehicles, as a consequence of these tariffs.
Pretty much everything we buy.
A lot of it, yes. Beyond just higher prices, tariffs can also lead to a reduction in the variety of goods available to us. By making some imported goods less profitable or even unprofitable to sell in the U.S. market, tariffs can limit the range of choices we have as consumers.
Less choice on the shelves.
Could be. And again, it's important to emphasize that the impact of tariffs on consumer goods tends to be regressive, disproportionately affecting households with lower incomes. These families typically allocate a larger share of their income to essential goods, so any price increases resulting from tariffs will have a more significant impact on their household budgets.
Makes sense.
Ultimately, consumers are directly impacted by tariff policies, facing increased prices and potentially a more limited selection of goods, with lower-income households often bearing a disproportionate share of this burden. Tariffs on imported consumer goods act as a direct cost increase for households, reducing their disposable income and potentially forcing difficult spending decisions.
It sounds like almost every sector of the U.S. economy could feel some negative repercussions from these tariffs. Now, we've touched on it a few times, but let's delve deeper into the role of retaliation. How significant is it when one country imposes tariffs?
Retaliation is critical and often a very damaging aspect of tariff policies. When one country imposes tariffs, it very frequently triggers retaliatory measures from its trading partners.
The tit for tat.
Exactly, leading to a cycle of escalating tariffs and the real risk of full-scale trade wars. This widespread protectionism can lead to increased costs and disruptions across numerous markets. We've seen this pattern historically.
Like when?
Well, the steel tariffs imposed by the Bush administration and the tariffs the Trump administration placed on Chinese goods were both met with retaliatory tariffs from the affected countries. And these recent tariff announcements for 2025 have already elicited threats of countermeasures from many nations around the globe.
So it's happening now.
The threats are there. Retaliatory tariffs can severely harm a country's export-oriented industries, as we saw with the substantial decline in U.S. agricultural exports to China following tariff disputes.
Back to agriculture.
Yep. Economic modeling of a potential trade war between the U.S. and the European Union indicates that tariffs would negatively impact both economies, and these adverse effects would be amplified by retaliatory actions. The escalation of tariffs can lead to broader trade conflicts with significant global economic repercussions.
Oh, global impact.
Definitely. Economists have cautioned that the proposed 2025 tariffs could trigger serious recessions in both the U.S. and the global economy if they lead to widespread retaliatory measures. Experts at the PIIE have even characterized the 2025 tariffs as the initiation of a trade war by the U.S.
Wow, strong words.
They are. And the historical example of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act vividly illustrates how protectionist policies can precipitate a global trade war with devastating consequences. These tariff disputes can have far-reaching effects on global trade and international economic relationships.
Like what kind of effects?
Trade wars can increase the volatility of stock markets and alter patterns of global investment. They can also erode international business confidence, damage trade relations between countries, and ultimately lead to job losses. Large-scale unilateral tariff actions can weaken the established framework of international trade governance.
Undermining the system.
Right, and increase the risk of further trade disputes. The implementation of tariffs is rarely an isolated event in our interconnected global economy. It frequently provokes retaliatory actions from trading partners, starting a cycle of escalating tariffs that inflict harm on all involved economies and disrupt established international trade relationships.
It sounds like a very risky path with potentially damaging consequences for all involved. Speaking of historical precedents, you mentioned the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act earlier. Could you elaborate on that and what lessons it might offer for our current situation?
Sure. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, enacted in 1930, serves as a really significant historical case study regarding the impact of high tariffs.
Right, in the Depression.
Exactly. It was implemented during the Great Depression with the primary aim of protecting American businesses and farmers from foreign competition by significantly increasing import duties on thousands of goods. The average tariff increases were quite substantial across the board.
Did it work?
Well, the economic consequences were severe, and it's widely regarded as having actually exacerbated the Great Depression in the U.S. and worldwide.
Made it worse.
That's the consensus. The act led to a dramatic decline in U.S. trade with other countries, with the volume of imports plummeting by nearly half in the years that followed. In response to the U.S. tariffs, over 25 countries retaliated by increasing their own tariffs on American goods, triggering a global trade war.
The retaliation we talked about.
On a massive scale. This widespread protectionism resulted in a drastic contraction of international trade, estimated at around 65%.
Two-thirds drop. What?
It was devastating. The experience of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act offers really enduring lessons about the dangers of protectionist trade policies. It underscored the significant risks associated with high tariffs and their potential to severely harm the global economy. The negative consequences of the act contributed to a long-term shift in global trade policy towards the promotion of free trade agreements and international trade cooperation.
So, a major turning point.
A painful one. Given the magnitude and breadth of the proposed tariffs in 2025, many economists have drawn parallels to the Smoot-Hawley Act, raising serious concerns about the potential for similarly negative economic outcomes.
History repeating itself.
That's the fear. The historical catastrophe of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act stands as a stark and cautionary reminder of the severe negative consequences that can arise from implementing high and widespread tariffs, including a collapse in international trade and a deepening of economic depressions.
That's a sobering historical example indeed. Now let's consider the timing. Are the economic consequences of tariffs different in the short term compared to the long term?
Yes, they do tend to manifest differently over short and longer time horizons. In the short term, tariffs might offer some immediate protection to specific domestic industries, potentially leading to a temporary increase in production and employment within those sectors.
Some initial gain.
Possibly. They also typically result in an immediate increase in the prices of imported goods, which can quickly affect consumers through higher retail costs. As imports become more expensive, there might be a temporary increase in demand for domestically produced goods as consumers and businesses seek alternatives.
A shift in demand.
Right. However, the uncertainty surrounding tariff policies and the potential for retaliatory actions from trading partners can swiftly erode any initial positive effects and introduce instability into the economy.
So the short-term positives might not last?
Often they don't, especially if retaliation kicks in. The long-term economic consequences of tariffs, however, tend to be considerably more detrimental to the overall health of the domestic economy.
Okay, the long view.
Research consistently indicates that tariffs lead to persistent declines in output growth and productivity over the long run. By reducing competition from foreign producers, tariffs can foster inefficiencies within protected industries and diminish the incentives for innovation and productivity improvements. These long-term effects can manifest as slower overall economic growth and reduced living standards for the population.
Stifling growth long-term.
That's the finding. Modeling by the Yale Budget Lab suggests that the implementation of tariffs can lead to a persistently smaller U.S. economy in the long run, indicating a sustained negative impact on economic output. Furthermore, tariffs can distort the allocation of resources within the economy, shifting investment and labor towards less efficient sectors and thereby diminishing overall productivity.
Misallocating resources.
Exactly. So while tariffs might offer a superficial and temporary benefit to select domestic industries, the overwhelming evidence suggests that their long-term consequences are detrimental to the overall health and dynamism of the domestic economy, leading to reduced growth, productivity, and potentially lower living standards. The short-term appeal often obscures the more profound and lasting negative impacts.
So perhaps a temporary and isolated boost for a few, but likely long-term pain for the majority of the U.S. economy. That seems to be the consistent message we're hearing. Now, as we begin to wrap up this deep dive, what's the general consensus among economists when it comes to the broad application of tariffs? Are there any significant disagreements within the academic community?
Well, the academic literature on the impact of tariffs reveals a fairly strong consensus on several key points. There's a general agreement among economists that broad-based tariffs typically lead to higher prices for consumers, thereby reducing their purchasing power.
Okay, consensus on higher prices.
Yes. Furthermore, there's a robust consensus that tariffs tend to harm overall economic growth and productivity in the long run. The potential for retaliatory tariffs and subsequent trade wars are also widely recognized concerns.
Growth, productivity, retaliation, general agreement there.
Broadly, yes. Economists generally agree that tariffs tend to be regressive, disproportionately affecting lower-income households. And finally, there's widespread skepticism regarding the effectiveness of tariffs as a primary tool for reducing trade deficits.
So a lot of agreement on the downsides.
A significant amount. Despite this consensus, some debates and varying viewpoints do exist. Arguments are occasionally made for the use of targeted tariffs to protect nascent industries or for national security reasons.
Specific exceptions, maybe.
Potentially. There are also ongoing discussions about the precise magnitude of the impact. Some studies find larger or smaller effects depending on the context and methods used. Some more heterodox economic perspectives propose tariffs might offer benefits under very specific macroeconomic conditions, though these are outside the mainstream. And, there are historical debates about tariffs in 19th century U.S. industrialization.
So nuances exist.
Absolutely. While a strong consensus prevails against broad-based tariffs, some debates persist, particularly concerning targeted tariffs for specific objectives and the precise quantification of effects. But the overwhelming agreement underscores the arguments against broad protectionism.
Got it. So the overwhelming evidence points to negative consequences from these widespread tariffs. Now, for our listeners who are small business owners here in the U.S., this information might be quite concerning. Drawing from the How CFOs Can Blunt Tariff Harm article we looked at, what are some practical steps they can take to try and navigate these challenging times?
Right, this is a really important question for those directly impacted. And the good news is that there are some proactive measures small business owners can consider to help mitigate the potential adverse effects. The article highlights several key tools and strategies.
On that, practical steps. Good.
One is the first sale for export rule. This allows importers to declare the value of imported goods for customs based on the initial sale from the manufacturer to an intermediary rather than the final sale price.
How does that help?
It can potentially reduce the declared value and, consequently, the amount of tariff owed.
Lower taxable value.
Exactly. Another area to explore is various duty minimization programs. These include strategies like valuation unbundling, separating the value of different components, and the utilization of foreign trade zones, if that's viable. Foreign trade zones are areas within the U.S. but legally outside U.S. customs territory, which can offer certain tariff advantages.
Interesting options.
The article also mentions duty drawback, a program allowing recovery of certain tariffs paid, though there's a caveat. It's not permissible for some existing tariffs, and applicability to these new reciprocal tariffs is uncertain.
Okay, worth looking into, but check the details.
Definitely. One practice the article specifically advises against is trying to artificially separate the price of goods from intellectual property payments to avoid duties. Customs usually sees through that.
Don't try to game the system that way.
Right. It's also really crucial for CFOs, and by extension small business owners, to consult with their boards, if applicable, about the significant potential impact of these tariffs on costs, expenses, and competitiveness. The article suggests voicing concerns collectively through industry trade groups can also be beneficial.
Strength in numbers.
Perhaps. And the overarching recommendation is definitely not to adopt a wait-and-see approach. Businesses need to proactively start planning for tariff mitigation early. This might involve engaging third-party specialists and leveraging technology for modeling scenarios and integrating tariff planning into their overall trade strategy.
Plan early. Get help.
Exactly. Taking early action can significantly improve preparedness and help avoid last-minute scrambling.
Those are some really concrete and actionable steps that could potentially make a significant difference for small businesses facing these new tariffs. So, to recap, we've seen that these broad-based tariffs are likely to have considerable negative consequences for the U.S. economy, impacting consumers through higher prices and businesses through increased costs and disruptions. The historical lessons from Smoot-Hawley serve as a stark warning.
A very stark warning.
However, on a more positive note for our listeners who are small business owners, there are proactive measures they can consider, like exploring first sale for export, duty minimization programs, and seeking expert consultation to try and mitigate some of these adverse effects.
And as we've delved into the complexities and potential downsides of tariffs today, it prompts a really important question for you, our listener. Considering all of these potential negative economic consequences, what innovative strategies beyond the realm of traditional trade policy could the U.S. explore to genuinely enhance domestic economic resilience and long-term global competitiveness? It's a crucial point to consider as we navigate this evolving economic landscape.
Absolutely. Some important food for thought as we conclude this deep dive into the potential impacts of the newly announced tariffs on the U.S. economy. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion.
Thank you from all of us at Murphy Business Sales for taking the time to learn about this important topic. We look forward to working together to achieve your business aspirations. For more information or a complimentary consultation for sell-side services, visit us at murphybusiness.com/Edison and complete our Contact Us form.